Thank you all very, very much for being here. It's a real pleasure to have Caroline and Dan here. This is an invited seminar at Center for Global Development that would have happened many, many, many months ago if I had gotten my act together earlier. But I've been wanting to have Caroline and also Dan for quite a while, and it's just a real pleasure to do it today. I want to briefly introduce them. Caroline Fry finished her PhD at MIT last year and is now an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And in addition to a background in econ, she has a background in natural sciences and organic chemistry and has worked in several emerging markets. And that might be one of many reasons why her work on migration is so much more interesting than the standard labor econ paradigm. She studies, among other things, how international networks create innovation and entrepreneurship in sciences and in business in emerging markets, and particularly through the channel of highly educated migrants. And we're just really delighted to have new research of hers here today. Discussing that research right after she finishes, it's just a real pleasure to have Dan Wang, who's an associate professor at Columbia Business School. Dan's research, not coincidentally, focuses on, well, a big chunk of it focuses on the role that highly educated migrants, both immigrants and return migrants, have in spreading innovation and entrepreneurship around the world. And for that and other reasons, it's just really hard to think of a better discussant for Caroline than Dan. And it's just it's a privilege to have both of you in the same quote unquote room. We're gonna have half an hour of Caroline, during which any questions, please just put them in the chat. And if there are things that need to be addressed immediately, I will rudely interrupt Caroline. If they're not, then we'll just they'll be in the chat, and we will definitely get to them at the end. Followed by 10 minutes of Dan, and then until the hour, we've got an open discussion. So Caroline, thank you so much.
Excellent, thank you so much. So you can all see my slides hopefully. So thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor to present some new work to this community. So I'm very happy to talk today about a project co-authored with Jeff Furman on the consequences of South-South migration of female scientists. So just a quick story to set the scene. So in 2013, a female neuroscience researcher from Nigeria here traveled to China for a PhD fellowship. This was a fantastic opportunity for her to access some skills and lab equipment that weren't available in Nigeria. And this was also, and perhaps more importantly, and what I'm particularly interested in, an opportunity to develop an international network, which is critical for publications and grants in global science. And potentially she could share those connections with her colleagues and future mentees back at home in Nigeria. However, she faced several challenges which could have limited the extent to which this opportunity was converted into actual outcomes. For example, her host in China didn't allow her to take her newborn child with her, which limited the duration of her stay. And back at home in Nigeria, while she described having the support of her immediate family to us, she told us the way in which her peers, most of whom were male, greeted her with skepticism in the academy. So given these anecdotal challenges that female migrants in particular may have in leveraging their international networks, in this paper we asked whether and when female scientists migrating between South-South institutions can share the network that they develop abroad with their colleagues back at home. So a big spoiler alert, we find a strong evidence that female migrants are able to share their networks when both their home and their host countries have high levels of gender parity. And I'll explain more about what that means. And we explore some mechanisms that might explain this result. And the evidence we use for this finding is from an evaluation of the migration of developing country female scientists to other developing countries as part of a PhD fellowship that supports their studies in another country in the global south. And we estimate the impact of their migration on the collaboration patterns of non-migrants in their home institution or in the sending country. And to ascertain a causal effect of this migration event, we exploit the timing of the migration of these female scientists, which is arguably somewhat random to those non-migrants in the home institution. And we compare these within non-migrant changes in collaboration outcomes before and after the fellowship with that of non-migrants in institutions who have an unsuccessful applicant to the same fellowship program in a differences and differences framework. So just a quick roadmap of today's talk for the next 30 minutes or so. So I'll go over some motivation and then talk about the study setting and the data we use, and then I'll get to some results and some potential policy implications. So why are we asking this question at all? So although it's an important driver of health, economic, and other outcomes, the production of brand new to the world knowledge is dominated by a handful of countries in the world. So this map shows the location of the production of publications in the last few years. And this skew in production of publications is observable even after accounting for GDP differences across countries. So something else driving this skew in science. And countries in the global south face significant challenges in participating in global science, the rising cost of science, the role of reputation in elite circles, just a few. We also have a good understanding that knowledge doesn't travel very well over geographic distance. And so for those located far away from the world's central knowledge producing hubs, it can be a challenge to access the latest knowledge, which is a critical input into subsequent knowledge generation. And furthermore, as in rich countries, the proportion of women in science in the global south is very low, owing to significant barriers for female scientists in obtaining, the relevant education and overcoming discrimination. So we estimate the proportion of women affiliated with countries in the global south amongst publishing scientists captured in the Elsevier Scopus database by assigning gender to scientists by using first names in the author list of publications. And as you can see from this plot of male and female researchers who are publishing in each year, around 30% of publishing scientists are women across countries in the global south. And this proportion is lower for more senior scientists or older scientists, suggesting that they drop off, consistent with our knowledge of what goes on in high-income countries too. And this pattern remains relatively constant over time. But one solution to scientists from less developed countries, and especially to these female scientists, is to migrate to another country in order to access resources, knowledge, and be in a more favorable environment. So the rate of migration of scientists from developing countries and programs and policies to support the migration of scientists is rising. And this is actually particularly true, as you can see from this graph, when it comes to migration to other countries in the global south, which are more accessible in many ways to developing country scientists. So while early literature on the migration of high-skilled workers from developing countries tended to focus on the issue of brain drain or loss of human capital, more recently, a growing literature, thanks to many people here, has studied the positive benefits to a sending country. So migrants from developing countries can come back with skills, and even if they stay abroad, they can be useful to the sending country by sending knowledge back or by raising the incentives for higher education back at home. And an additional hope, and what I'm particularly interested in, is that migrants either who stay abroad or who come back home can share their international networks with others back at home, or they can broker these connections, which I'll use as a term from now on to mean being a middle person between two previously connected, disconnected groups. So migrants can share information about their home or host country. They can facilitate introductions, and thereby they can contribute to the building of these global networks, which ultimately can aid the transfer of knowledge and resources back to developing countries and generate significant positive spillovers to that sending country. And this is a particularly important tool or potentially relevant tool in the development of scientific capacity in countries in the global south. So previous research has found that resources, knowledge, and skills that international networks can provide could impact the development of scientific capacity, but there are lots of frictions in the formation of networks, and particularly these South-South networks. So scientists in less developed countries have limited visibility. So there are rarely websites of institutions or individual scientists, and there are barriers to attending international conferences where lots of people meet their international collaborators. And so these migrants could potentially help alleviate these significant frictions that already exist. So there's hope and anecdotal evidence from outside the scientific setting that suggests migrants can play this role, but we actually know very little about the migration of scientists who face a separate set of challenges, and how different countries, and particularly different institutional contexts in the global south, can influence these kinds of spillovers, especially from female migrants. And unfortunately, there's good reason to think that the country or the institutional context might affect a migrant's ability to share their international networks. So recent research has found that in some contexts, this brokerage, or facilitating these introductions, isn't really activated because of cultural apprehensions towards brokers, or problems that brokers might have, or migrants might have, embedding themselves in their home and host country. And institutional context could be particularly relevant for women who already face challenges occupying a brokerage role. So prior literature has described the idea that brokerage is often perceived as a man's work due to its connection of control and arbitrage. So together, this motivates the question that we ask in this paper. So can South-South female migrants share their international networks with colleagues back at home? And secondarily, what role does institutional context play in the extent to which female migrants share their networks? And on the latter question, in this study, we focus on the role of gender equality in their home and host country, in the likelihood that female migrants share their networks with their home country colleagues. So just to fix ideas on the study setup and shed some light on the theoretical underpinning, in this figure, if A is the migrant who left from the University of Nigeria and traveled to China, they could share their information about Chinese researchers with B, who's still working in the University of Nigeria, who I hereby refer to as the non-migrant, or the focus of our study. They could share information about Nigerian researchers with their new Chinese colleagues, C and D, or they could just make that direct introduction between B and C and D in China. And so we argue in this paper that both home and host country gender equality affects the likelihood that B forms a connection with C and D after the migration event. So why would the institutional context affect this female migrants' network sharing capabilities? Well, female migrants' colleagues in home and host countries with high levels of gender parity are more likely to be familiar with female scientists, particularly those in positions of authority, and they're less likely to have expectations that a woman occupies traditional gender roles or non-brokerage roles, as I mentioned. So we argue that colleagues back at home and in host institutions who are in countries with higher levels of gender parity are more likely to consider the female migrant a legitimate broker, and are more likely to trust that information that the female migrant's providing. In addition, the female migrant is more likely to be embedded in networks in the home and host country, or in a formal position of authority in countries with high levels of gender equality, which in turn would facilitate their sharing of networks. So to explore these ideas, the setting for our study is the Organization for Women in Science in the Developing World, or OST, I'll call it from now on. So OST's mission is to reduce barriers that exist for migrant female scientists. So a fantastic program for our research question. And it's a program unit of UNESCO. It's really the first and only source of systematic support for female scientists in developing countries. So its flagship program is a PhD fellowship for female scientists in low-income countries, which supports them to study in another country in the global south. So women from institutions in the global south can apply for a sandwich fellowship, which supports an international fellowship for 6 months to a year, or they can apply for a full-time fellowship, which supports their entire PhD studies abroad. So these women apply to the program with an acceptance letter in hand from another host institute in a developing country. And then a scientific committee in Italy evaluates the applications and selects fellows to receive the award each year based on scientific merit, but they also attempt to achieve variation amongst fellows across scientific fields and geographic areas. So we sort of take advantage of this somewhat random selection of fellows each year. So since 1998, which is the start of their PhD fellowship program, they've awarded over 750 PhD fellowships across 36 countries in the Global South. And although the program has boasted of great anecdotal success to both the fellow and to the home country, to date, there hasn't been a systematic evaluation of the program. So we evaluate whether and when PhD fellows connect their home organization, non-migrant scientists, to host country scientists in a difference in differences framework. And specifically, we look at the change in collaboration outcomes of non-migrants in the home organization who work in the same scientific field as the fellow, or we call them treated scientists from now, before and after the fellowship. And we compare that to the change in collaboration outcomes of non-migrants who are working in the same organization and the same scientific field as an unsuccessful applicant to the fellowship, or we'll call them control scientists. And so we can assume that those unsuccessful applicants didn't make the migration event, but the successful fellows did. So this is a sample graph of the test we'll be running. So essentially, we're going to track the collaboration outcomes of scientists in the organization of these successful fellows before the fellowship and after. And if we assume that the outcomes of scientists in institutions with a successful fellow would have continued along the same path as that of scientists in institutions with an unsuccessful fellow in the absence of the fellowship, then any additional jump after the fellowship in the collaboration outcomes of scientists in institutions with a successful fellow can be attributed to the impact of the fellowship program or the migration event. Okay, so the data for the project comes from a few different places. So OST provided us with the names, the dissertation title and year of application for all applicants to the program between 1998 and 2014, who agreed to have their names used in the study, which is a representative sample. We did some checks. So this gives us 64 successful fellows and 63 unsuccessful applicants. So we also obtained information on the applicant's home institute, which is usually where they're working as a researcher at the time of application, or actually several of the applicants had started a PhD at this institute already. And we obtained the proposed host institute, so that at the time of application, where they're asking to go. And then we matched this with the full publication history and career history of each fellow or applicant. And in the main results I present today, I'm going to be agnostic as to whether they return home after the fellowship or how long they spend abroad. But in the paper, we dig into that a little bit and look at what matters. And so we can talk about it in the Q&A if anybody's interested. So we identified the non-migrants in the home institutions, who are the unit of observation in our study, through the use of the Elsevier Scopus publication database and affiliation data. So we took the entire universe of publishing scientists affiliated with countries in the Global South, and we just extract scientists affiliated with a home institution of an applicant in the 3 years prior to the fellowship and publishing in the same scientific field. And as an example of scientific field, this is so agricultural sciences or medical sciences. We try one unit more detailed, but it doesn't seem to make a difference. So this gives us just over 3,000 treated scientists and just under 2,000 control scientists. And then for each non-migrant in the sample, we collect their publication history. And for the 3 years before and 6 years after the fellowship, we generate annual variables of their collaboration patterns. And so the two main outcome measures are generated from this publication data. And for each non-migrant, we measure the annual number of collaborations with scientists in the host country of the fellow or unsuccessful applicant, and the number of new collaborative relationships formed with host country scientists or proposed host country scientists. So where possible, we also find out the gender of the non-migrant scientists by assigning gender to first names in publication records. So we used a company called Ethnic Technologies who specialize in generating algorithms to ascertain gender and ethnicity of a variety of global names. And then for each non-migrant in the sample, we also get data on their home country gender parity and gender parity in this proposed host country of the fellow or applicant. So our main measure of gender parity is the UNDP Gender Development Index. So this index is a composite index across health, education, and income of men and women. We chose this measure because it's commonly used in the literature and it has really good coverage over our countries and our time period. But for robustness, we test a variety of alternate indices and also individual components of these indices. And we seem to find similar results across these indices. Okay, so here's a flight map of the fellow's home and host country, just to give an idea of the geographic spread of our treated sample. So a lot of fellows are going to host organizations in South Africa, plenty are going to China, Pakistan, Brazil, Malaysia, but almost 90% of applicants come from African countries. So onto the findings. So we just plot here the average number of collaborative publications and the number of new collaborative relationships with scientists from the host country of the fellow or the unsuccessful applicant for each non-migrant in the fellow or applicant's home organization before and after the fellowship. So the treated scientists or those in an organization with a successful fellow are represented by the bold line at the top here, and the control are those represented by that dashed line. And the vertical dash is the year of the fellowship. So just in this plot of raw data, so we can see a few trends emerging. So first, the two groups do differ slightly before the fellowship application in terms of the level of collaboration with host country. But the trend looks somewhat comparable, and we attempt to account for these level differences in the empirical analysis. But second, and hopefully more interestingly, this does seem to be a positive effect of the fellowship, and this effect appears to be growing over time. Okay, so I showed you a plot of the raw data, but because of these differences, and in case these trends that we find are driven by underlying differences in non-migrants' age or ability, in the empirical analysis, we measure the change in outcomes before and after the fellowship of each non-migrant in a treated institution as compared to that in a control institution, holding constant underlying differences between non-migrants and temporal trends. So we include individual fixed effects, career age trends, and year fixed effects. And because we're interested in heterogeneous effects according to home and host country gender parity, in the paper we run triple differences specification, or we just interact gender parity with this main interaction post-fellowship times host organization. But today I'll actually show you results of the analysis on separate subsamples according to gender parity of home and host country, which is a slightly stricter analysis, and so perhaps more interesting for to look at. So here are the results of this analysis, so the inclusion of those fixed effects on these separate samples. So in this graph, the height of the bar corresponds to the average treatment effect for a particular group of treated non-migrants as compared to those control non-migrants in the same group. Or the difference in the change in collaborative publications with host country between treated and controlled non-migrants after the fellowship, holding constant that individual differences, career age, and year trends. So as you can see from the two bars on the left, non-migrants in countries with high levels of gender parity experience a significantly larger treatment effect of the fellowship on collaborative outcomes. And in fact, following the fellowship award, these non-migrants in high gender parity countries produce around 10% more collaborative publications with fellows host country scientists than those in low gender parity countries. But the host country gender parity doesn't appear on its own to make much difference. And similarly, this plot shows the difference in the change in the number of new collaborative relationships with host country scientists. And again, non-migrants in countries with high levels of gender parity are significantly more likely to generate these new relationships with host country scientists. So put it into context, they generate around 17% more new collaborative relationships than those in control institutions, which amounts to around 0.5 collaborative relationships in a 6-year period, so across all treated scientists. But to put it another way, after the fellowship, almost half of the female migrants' colleagues in high gender parity countries collaborate with mostly new high host country scientists, whereas just sort of 10% of her colleagues in low gender parity and also in unsuccessful fellows organizations collaborate with host countries after the fellowship application. So going from 10 to 50% of the colleagues collaborating with this host country. And although we didn't see a strong effect of high gender parity host country on its own, we test whether gender parity in the home and host country are substitutes or complements. So is it enough for fellows to be in either a high gender parity home or host country, or do they need both? And so we ran the analysis on these separate groups according to each combination of home and host country gender parity. And we can see quite clearly that what matters is that both home and host country have high levels of gender parity. So the fellow needs to be perceived as legitimate in both the home and their host country in order to be able to share that information and broker those connections. So we'll just very briefly touch on some of the tests we ran to explore some potential mechanisms that could be driving the observed effect. So specifically earlier, I proposed that gender parity in the home and host country could affect the network sharing ability of women because of some sort of trust of women arising from familiarity with women in a brokerage or a senior position. And so if this was true, we would expect that female migrants in low gender parity countries would also be better able to share their networks if they're from organizations with a higher proportion of women, particularly a higher proportion of women in senior positions. So we find supporting evidence for this idea, which implies that however it's achieved, perceived legitimacy and trust of women in this role is a critical factor in their ability to share their connections. We also propose that the female migrant themselves might be more embedded in a more senior position in high gender parity countries, and that might affect their perceived legitimacy as a broker. So we find support for this mechanism as well. Specifically, female migrants tend to collaborate more with home country and host country researchers when they're in high gender parity countries respectively. And we find that these female migrants are also more likely to be in more senior formal roles in high gender parity countries. So while we interpret these results as giving support for our hypothesis that gender parity affects network sharing of a female migrant, we consider some alternative explanations that could be driving the observed effect. So one concern with our interpretation of the results might be that countries with high gender parity might just be better or better scientifically, and this might affect the migrants' ability to share that network. So we control for differences in GDP, scientific capacity, internet access, and also language, and find that the results are robust. And even more, female migrants from countries with low GDP and worse scientific capacity seem to have a greater effect, all else equal. So we don't think that this is driving the results. It could also be the effect that the effect is mechanical if countries with high gender parity have more female scientists. And to the extent that you think that a female migrant might be more likely to impact a woman at home because of homophily and mentoring or collaborations, this can mean that they have a greater impact independent of a mechanism or trust. It could just be a mechanical. So we tested this is true by controlling for the number of women in an organization. We find the results are robust. And in fact, we find that non-migrant men benefit more than non-migrant women in the home organization. So interested to hear any interpretations of that, but we don't think this is driving our result. And finally, we test whether countries with high gender parity are sending higher quality female fellows, or whether the female fellows decide to spend shorter time abroad because it's a more favorable environment for them at home. And so that's driving the effects. So we again find the opposite. Fellows from countries with high gender parity are actually worse performing on observables before their application. And after the fellowship, we find no difference on where they locate or their post-fellowship productivity. Okay, so to conclude, hopefully I'm on time. So in this study, we find that migrants can alleviate frictions in the formation of these international networks in science, but that their effectiveness in generating these benefits for home country or the sending country are contingent on the environment back at home and the environment in their host country. And so this implies that in order to capture those full spillover benefits of migration, it's important to design and implement policies to confer legitimacy on these migrants, particularly those from these disadvantaged groups. And these heterogeneous effects have implications, we think, for the costs and benefits of migration. So this could impact decisions to migrate or to support migration. So on the former decision, a migrant's decision to migrate, in a perfect economic world, an individual's decision to migrate is a function of the costs and benefits. And to the extent that some groups cannot achieve the same benefits, this could differentially impact their decision to migrate. Or in other words, it's sort of common to think of the costs that women in particular face in migrating, but we suggest a greater consideration of the potential benefits in order to encourage migration of women or disadvantaged groups. And finally, so typical evaluations of programs of this kind evaluate the impact of the program on the treated individual, the migrating individuals, in this case, the fellows. And sometimes there are disappointing results to these evaluations. So our findings imply that perhaps we're not looking in quite the right place for the impact of these programs or the full impact of these programs. And it's really important to evaluate the broader impact in order to fully assess the cost effectiveness of these programs. So my very last point is that previous studies have found little benefit to funding scientists in the US. So I can point you to some of that literature, but together with some of my other work on the benefit to African scientists of studying in the United States, I think it's possible that the rate of return to funding these developing country science programs could be even greater than that of programs in more developed countries. And it seems to us that given these spillovers of these programs, they really do seem worthy of more support, and also that this is a very fertile area for future research. Okay, so hopefully I'm on time. Thank you very, very much. And I can be found here. Thank you.
Well, I'll stay on time. Thank you so much. And let's go straight to Dan. And if anybody has questions now, just either raise your hand as a placeholder or put whatever you want in the chat. Dan, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Michael. And thanks so much, Caroline. Caroline, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen so that I can share mine with some slides. But while she's doing that, and while I'm getting my slides going, let me just say that this was an extraordinarily difficult task to comment on Caroline and Jeff's paper because it is already so good. It has already covered so much territory, anticipated so many concerns that I would have as, say, a reviewer or editor for a journal that they might submit this to, that it made it very hard to find anything that is worthy of raising questions about. That is to say that this is a very complete study. Let me just brag about kind of Caroline's whole research program to begin with. The main thing that I find so impressive about this work, as well as Caroline's other work, is that it's difficult to study social networks, and it's even harder to study social networks that change. At the same time, it's difficult to study migration because data are often not uniform, but it's even harder to study migration several steps away, such as return migrants, such as those that Caroline studies. So you take the extreme difficulty of studying both of these areas and put it together in one paper, and that's what Caroline and Jeff are trying to do here. And they do so, I think, in a remarkably clean way. The presentation itself was incredibly clear, and I think we all got a good picture of what the implications of the results are, which are broad and far-reaching. So the way that I'm going to do this to kind of cover the ground on this impressively complete study is, I don't know where I got this, but I like that it rhymes. I'm going to talk about the paper's glows and grows. So we're going to go through some glows and grows. So in terms of the glows, I will say that this is one of the few but much needed papers on migration networks across the global south. You'll notice that it's important that Caroline said this is south to south migration. Usually we think about migration from developing countries to more the developed world and reverse brain drain in the opposite direction. But this is a unique aspect of this study, and we can still learn a lot about the variation. In fact, it's where we should be learning about variation in migration outcomes. Of course, you got great insight into the very creative and clever research design that Caroline used, matching unsuccessful to successful applicants at the organizational level. It's clever, passes all the numerous differences in different diff tests. And so it was impressive to see this unfold in a unique setting. In addition, as I mentioned before, lots of these outcome measures, as well as the explanatory variables, are very difficult to operationalize. Can you be sure, for example, if you're a social network study, that a tie is a tie? How can you be sure that people are actually moving and people are not actually moving? How do you track that in data? I'm completely convinced that the data that they have here are measuring what they're measuring. The other aspect that, to me as an organizational scholar, is really important is that all of this migratory activity and spillover activity is occurring within the organization. Michael was just the keynote speaker at a conference that we just held on migration organizations, and he made this point much more eloquently. But the idea here is that so much of our work on migration, whether it's from economics, sociology, or political science, takes a look at this phenomenon from a bird's eye point of view, when in fact, so much of what is to be understood about the kind of puzzles in this world occur within organizational settings. And this is one that takes the organization seriously. And of course, I'll talk about the broad implications later, and Caroline has already given you a great insight into that. In terms of the grows here, these are more things that came to mind. It's nothing to resolve, but more provocative questions that I was thinking about, and I'd love to hear Caroline's perspective on. So I'm not going to go through all of them just to summarize them. I'm just going to go through each of them in turn. And the first one, I think is actually a fun one. It's kind of thinking about the introduction to the paper in terms of clarifying the locus of the actual motivation and the theoretical puzzle that this is addressing, assuming that it's going to kind of a journal that I think it's kind of going to. This is something that editors and reviewers really care a whole lot about. The best way to think about this is to ask the question, what is the crux of the theoretical argument? Well, where's this one relationship that animates the entire paper, which is the idea that potential brokers form networks. These are individuals that sit between clusters that form network ties between clusters. That's essentially what these women scientists are doing when they come back to their home countries after taking back from this program. But that's not always successful. Why? Because after hearing Caroline's presentation, we know that it's because there's variation in the perceived legitimacy of these women scientists when they play these brokerage roles. And so there's a lot that we actually know about this process right now. We know that brokers tend to broker. This is work from Georg Simmel and David Krackhart, who says that one of the most common ways by which networks gain more ties is through these kind of referrals and introductions through brokers. If I have a friend and I have another friend, chances are they're probably going to be friends with one another because either I introduced them or they're similar to one another in some way because they're both friends with me. In addition, we also know that brokers can play different kinds of roles. So it's not always this kind of friendly introductory role. They can be gatekeepers as well. That's a paper that Caroline and Jeff cite in their paper, Roger Gold and Roberto Fernandez, 1994. And we also know that the perception of brokers varies by varies by national context. There's this wonderful paper by Xiao and Sui in 2007. I forget, I think it's ASQ or AMJ or something like that, where they find basically that in high commitment cultures, such as in collectivist cultures, brokers aren't seen as positively. In fact, the returns to brokering relationships isn't as high in those types of cultures. And also we know a great deal, but not enough about gender differences in brokerage relationships and networking. So this is what we know. We know all about the relationship that's horizontal on the left of your screen. But in terms of possible puzzles, I think what could use some clarification is whether the dilemma here theoretically is really on the independent variable side or the outcome variable side. And so the way I read your paper is that I thought that more of your motivation was coming from the independent variable side, which is the idea that this aspect of perceived legitimacy of the broker is either misunderstood or not completely understood, or we don't have really good measures of that. And your study addresses those gaps. But the other way to kind of look at this is that this outcome variable of network formation has also kind of been overlooked. And I'm a person who's guilty of this. When I study migration, I don't look at network formation as an outcome. I presume the network is static. I look at the stuff that flows between the networks. Compared to what Caroline is doing, what I'm doing is easy peasy. And this is something that's much more challenging. And so one way to perhaps motivate the paper with greater clarity is to acknowledge these two possible puzzles and perhaps clarify which one that this paper is really seeking to address. If there's a secondary motivation, it could go into discussion. So that's one way to think about how to do this. Related to that, you could also think about, this would be in the discussion as well, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about the scope conditions of theoretical prediction. Let me show you one that I found particularly interesting, and it relates to the content of the exchange. And so brokers can broker a number of different things. In Caroline's study, they're brokering relationships. They're introducing people to one another. But brokers also sit at the intersection of social groups. So there's other stuff, resources that could flow through the broker. For example, knowledge, financial resources, referrals for work, things like this. And the way that legitimacy enters into whether a broker is successful at doing their role or performing their role might have something to do with the stuff that they're brokering. And so, for example, when it comes to brokering sharing connections, such as in Caroline's context, the legitimacy comes from the context or the environment around them, the cultural expectations about what brokerage is. When it comes to financial resources, it might be reputation. Trust might enter it for a different type of resource that's being brokered. And so I'm wondering whether this kind of model holds for other things that are being exchanged through brokers. In other words, does the theoretical prediction made in this paper extend to other forms of, you can think of it as broker anchored exchange. That's not a term, I just made it up for this deck. And so that's one way to think about this. And then I think the real interesting way to kind of push this paper further is to gain greater clarity on specifying what's actually going on with the mechanisms. You've already done such a wonderful job of exploring these alternative explanations and mechanisms. This is just to push you a little bit further, in particular, the gendering mechanism, to figure out what's actually going on here. And so in terms of what goes into this perceived legitimacy of the broker, you heard the paper, it's about the gender parity of the country. Greater gender parity means that there are lower gender parity in the home country means that there are professional expectations about what men and women should be doing, and there's greater gendered expectations about what brokerage actually is. This actually presents a really interesting question, because if you kind of look at this a little bit more deeply, you could think about how there's actually two kinds of explanations for why there's this interaction between home country gender parity and the success of having had a female scientist come back to your home organization if you're a non-migrant. So the first kind of explanation is that brokerage is gendered in general, just like all kinds of roles in a given society. But in a low gender parity country, it could be that it's less culturally accepted for women to be performing male roles or for men to be performing female roles. Or another way to think about this is that the roles themselves are more gendered, and there's a continuum. So it's tolerance for this kind of crossing between gendered roles, or is it the fact that the roles themselves are gendered? I think this is something that would be fascinating to explore. You could possibly tease this out. It could be both as well. And then the other kind of explanation is that I think there's a wonderful complement to a recent study that's done by, I think, your classmate. You might have overlapped with her. She happens to be my colleague, Mabel Abraham, who also studies gender and networks. And basically what she finds here is that she studies entrepreneurs in these clubs. And she studies something that's similar, but I think there's something missing in her study, which Caroline's study directly addressed. So what Mabel, my colleague, finds is that when women make referrals in these professional networking communities, they're more likely to be accepted if the goal of the referral is for a female typed job or role. And men, when they make a referral, they're more likely to be accepted when it's for a male typed role. And the reason why this is the case is because there are institutionalized beliefs about what men and women should be doing and expectations about that. That's called the third order status inference kind of explanation. And in Mabel's setting, takes place, I think, in Massachusetts somewhere, this is held constant. What Caroline's study does is that it shifts that. This kind of mechanism of expectations about what men and women should be doing changes across different countries. And so what she does is that she relaxes this assumption that's in Mabel's study and shows that actually, if you change the cultural expectations around you, that can lead to entirely different outcomes. But there is something that is in Caroline and Jeff's study that is held constant that in Mabel's study is not, which is that there's only a sample of women. at least in Caroline's study, among those who are doing the brokerage. That's not the case in Mabel's study here. But seeing that is that you have a complete picture when you put these two studies together. You know exactly what's going on here. So I loved kind of realizing that connection. And so the kind of last thing I want to talk about, not the last slide, but the last thing I want to talk about is, how exactly this institutional interaction actually intervenes in this process. So stay with me here. We can think about this in the following way. We can make the assumption, and what's going on in the study is actually going on. There are gendered expectations around brokerage in a country, and so women returning scientists have less success connecting their non-migrant coworkers because of one of three reasons. So they could intervene in one of three places. First is that women know about these gendered expectations around them, and they don't initiate as many cross-border collaborations. Or women in this setting initiate just as many cross-border collaborations, but they're just not as reciprocated as much as those that are initiated by men. Or it could go even further. Women initiate just as many reciprocated cross-border collaborations as men, and they're reciprocated, but for some reason the collaborations are less productive. So that's why you don't see as many publications. And so teasing this out, I think, is worth a little bit of effort. And fortunately, I've done a little bit of this. And so, Caroline, I took some of your data on the gender parity from the UNDP, and I entered into some data that I have on return migrants. And so let me show you the quick regression of all this. But this is a sample of skilled return migrants in the US. They all go to 100 different home countries. They're pretty diverse. 33% of them are women. The outcome variable for the model I'm going to show you is, this, by the way, comes from a survey that I did like 10 years ago. But one of the questions that these returnees answered on the survey is whether they initiated a connection between their employer and their home country after coming back to their home country and some US business partner in some way. So it's not quite the same as what you're studying, Caroline, but it is kind of like a cross-border connection that they're initiating in their home country with their host country. One independent variable is whether they're female. So this is comparing men and women. And another is whether they happen to be in a high gender parity country. I used your cutoff, the 10%, I think it was with the UNDP. So it's just a dummy variable here. And it's a logit model. And there are different versions of this dependent variable. And so there's different kinds of connections they could make. It could be a connection with a government partner, a business partner for hiring reasons, for kind of market growth reasons. And so I've shown this for all of these different dependent variables. The thing to pay attention to, however, is the interaction. And so what these results kind of show you here is that women overall, here's the takeaway, sorry, are less likely than men, at least in the sample that I have, to initiate a cross-border brokerage connection when they go back to their home countries. But that's regardless of the gender parity in their home countries. And so it could be that something else is going on here. It's not that they're not initiating less because of expectations about the expectations around them, but it could be something in the reciprocity process. This could be completely wrong as well, but at least it motivated me to do something else to think about this. And then finally, the most provocative question that this caused me to think about was about thinking about whether this is a study more about the cultural expectations of gender behavior or cultural expectations of broker behavior. And the reason why is because this is something that I'm always obsessed with, which is to think about a broker's choice. And so there are basically two images of what brokers can do. Brokers can either keep the social groups that they sit between apart, or they can form relationships with one another. According to Georg Simmel, keeping them apart is what gives the broker power. According to David Obstfeld, forming connections between them is how you become productive. And I'm wondering if this study could also tease out, what's culturally expected of a broker to begin with. And I felt that this intersection between gendered expectations, cultural expectations, and these two forms of broker behavior was a wonderful opportunity to at least think about that. And I'm not going to say anything more, but I'm going to leave everyone this question. Maybe Caroline can answer it. Through institutionalized beliefs, migration, we know through her results, can reify inequality. So what can we do about it? I'm sure we've been all thinking about this in terms of the post-pandemic for at least some of us world and what that might look like. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Sorry for going over. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Caroline, for that amazing presentation. And if anybody ever asks me for advice about how to be a good discussant, I'm just going to play the recording of Dan doing. I just happened to break out my own data and do my own regressions is several miles beyond the call. We only have about 10 minutes left, Caroline. So if you want to say anything about Dan's intervention, it'd be a great time to do it, or we could just collect more thoughts. Your call.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dan. That was incredibly helpful. And actually, we're looking to run a survey of the fellows. So this is fantastic pointers of which direction we could go in. Thank you. Yeah, I'm very happy to take any questions.
I had a few, and if you oppose my usurping as chair, please raise your hand in Zoom. Otherwise, I'll just make three comments. One of them's more a referee one kind of comment, and the other are more like referee two kind of comments. Oh, I gotta say, Dan, like tonight, my daughters are gonna hear about glows and grows, and they're not gonna know where, but I'll know. I don't think my citing you would mean anything to them. First, Dan talked about slicing to the theoretical crux, and his suggestion of how to do that was vastly richer than the very simple one that I thought of. Was that I'm usually more compelled by papers that, rather than saying like does fact X exist, use a fact to test dispositively between two models. Here's a couple of models of how the world could work. There's a couple of facts that are strictly incompatible between them, and guess what? The evidence is one and not the other one. And you know, when I thought about the relationship between national gender parity and what I'd expect the treatment effect to be, the first model that came to my completely ignorant mind was that a difficulty for knowledge production by capable women in some countries is just ideology preventing men from giving credence to their views or actually interacting with them in formal and informal ways. And if the problem were that the men at my institution all co-author with each other and sort of freeze me out of interactions that produce knowledge due to problems, the same problems that produce bad gender parity in my country, then the treatment effect for me could be greater, not less, from being connected to international networks, because finally I have people I can collaborate with, and that's more a theory, not about networks themselves, but about what's fundamentally holding back the production of knowledge by women in the country of origin. And this is an experiment to test between two different models of what the problem is in the country of origin. That's, I mean, that doesn't mean refocus the paper. I'm just giving that as an example of a way in which I could present two different simple models of a phenomenon of interest, and then use the experiment to present a fact which is strictly incompatible with one of them and not the other one. The second one, and I'm sure this is almost an altar you have to genuflect before now, but when you're doing a different diff regression, you just can't do a normal different diff regression anymore due to the advances in the methods literature. And so there is the idea out there that you only need to worry about these new different diff estimators when there's staggered treatment timing, but it's not true. Even when the treatment is simultaneous, as in your case, as long as there are dynamic and heterogeneous effects, this flotilla of recent papers has shown that there's bias generated by the two-way fixed effects estimator. Fortunately, as of mere weeks ago, there is now a stata implementation of the two leading ones, Borusiak, Haravel, and Spies, which I find to be the most intuitive one. Basically, it just estimates the the group fixed effects and the time fixed effects based on untreated observations. So the treated scientists before the event and the untreated scientists before and after, and leaves out the treated ones and the biases that they bring. And then there's also Callaway and Santana, and they're both just plug and play in Stata now. You don't, it's just vastly more accessible than it used to be. And then the third one was just, you said that selection into the program was basically random, but of course, referee two perks up at something like that and says, well, I'm sure the people in Italy were considering the potential for spillover effects in the country of origin when they inducted people into this program. If you wrote in your essay that I'm about the great spillover effects I'm going to have in my country of origin, didn't that make you more likely to be selected, and wouldn't that influence external validity? Not necessarily internal validity, but at least external validity. Those were just a few thoughts I wanted to share, but I don't want to. If there are others who'd like to talk, please go ahead. Otherwise, I'd love to give Caroline a few minutes to just react to Dan's much richer comments and anything I said that you might want to talk about.
Can I ask a technical question that it's probably super easy for you to answer, Caroline, on top of Michael's comments, which is, it's almost silly. I probably missed it in the paper, but an organization can have two of these fellows, right? Like more than one, or is that not possible? And if so, is that like variation that would help you better understand the mechanism?
Yeah, that's extremely rare. I think we've got 2 of those instances, but I'll try and dig into a little bit more and see. Yeah. So thank you, Michael. I mean, that's really, really helpful. I've been hiding from new, but I can't anymore. So, but your first comment's really interesting, and perhaps if you have any thoughts about one of our findings. So this idea that the treatment effect could be higher and setting up that tension, connecting it to the one might think that it would be higher for women, female non-migrants. So there's a bunch of female non-migrants in the home country, and they're left out of the game. And then you get another female migrant, it's like, oh, cool, now I can be connected internationally. And the fact that it's the men who benefit the most in both low and high gender parity countries was a bit perplexing to us, for sure. And we didn't really know how to fit it in and how to think about it. But I think that sort of suggests that this story is the other way around. But it would be really interesting if anyone has any thoughts about how to interpret that male effect. I mean, it just, yeah, definitely threw us when we found it.
I mean, I don't have any mechanism to suggest, but it really either this paper or a separate paper could be entirely about what do we learn from this experiment about the dynamics of information, knowledge, and transfer within the organizations. That just the intervention happens to be network formation, fine, but it's really what happens as a result of network formation would be radically different depending on what's the problem in the organization. And that's why it's a referee one kind of friendly comment. It's that there's nothing wrong at all with this paper, but it's saying you could explore other dimensions than because anything puzzling like this is the grounds for an interesting paper. The fact that it doesn't make sense is a reason to spend several days just thinking through what the mechanism for that could be, because that fact has to be compatible with some models and incompatible with other models of how information is generated and shared. But where that could come from, Dan, do you have thoughts on that?
It is interesting to think about from the broker's alters perspective, if that's what we're doing, right? So like if the alter is male, or potential alters mail, then they tend to benefit more. That's one of the other findings in the paper. I don't know, because I mean, like my sense is that this outcome variable of spillovers to other parts of a potential network is something that just isn't studied very much, and that's what I find so exciting about this work. You see flows, but you don't see network formation, and especially you don't know the identities of those that are being added to the network. But you have that here, and you know, my sense is that maybe there's some evidence for this idea about like gender role congruence. That's a term I learned from reading Mabel's paper. So it's the idea that it doesn't matter who the broker is, but it's a male typed role. And so men are also more likely to take advantage of being in the orbit of that, more likely in these countries that have low gender parity. And so that's something that I might think about in terms of the theoretical significance of that. I'm interested in Mead's comment in the chat. That's a direction that I was kind of going in and thinking about. Well, is one way to address this issue, like having a commitment prior to the fellowship event of one of the things that you have to do if and when you go back to your home country, which most of them do, is to forge cross-border collaborations. I think on an ad hoc basis, academics who traverse the world have these kinds of commitments. I know that the China context where this happens all the time. There are these kind of exchange relationships that are produced that sometimes can veer on the less ethical, but at the same time, it does produce exchange. And so I don't know, like it seems like a commitment device like that could solve some of the problems that you've unearthed in your findings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Mead. That's really interesting. And I haven't actually, we could sort of dig into grants that these women win afterwards and things, which we haven't done yet. But certainly we're, I would call us close with OST as well. So suggesting things that we think might help and future experiments, I think is fantastic.
I really, Mead is talking about the academic aspects of the paper, but also about policy aspects. And one that really strikes me is that, developing country institutions of research spend all kinds of money trying to augment their production and of knowledge and the influence of that knowledge, flying people around to conferences and buying incredibly expensive journals and that sort of thing. And this, I mean, I don't know what OST's budget for this kind of thing is, but if you got a citation per dollar estimate from this, it would probably compare favorably to many other things that they do. Mm-hmm. I feel like well, we are 5 minutes over, and I want to let everybody go, especially because some people on the call are up late. Thank you so much, Caroline and Dan. It's just been fantastic, and both of you come back soon, and be safe.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very, very much for having me and all the great comments and ideas.
Thank you, everyone.
Our honor. Bye-bye.
Bye.